11 is one of the saddest chapters, I think, in the Bible, because you have a man, David, a man after God's own heart, who has thus far not lived a sinless life, but lived a life that exemplifies the grace of his father that he's following, looks to his father for wisdom. God has granted him many victories on the battlefield. God has given him the joys of his heart. God has surrounded him with men who protect him, who are good for him. God has blessed David immensely, taking him from sitting out under a tree, daydreaming, watching sheep, to now shepherding God's people. An immense step, huge step. And he was doing so well. In fact, one of the older commentators said, if David's life could have just ended at the end of chapter 10, then we would never have chapter 11, but sadly, that's not the case. It happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem. We noted last week that David should not have been there. He should have been out with his men. That's what a king does, is lead his men in battle, in victory. David should not have stayed back. For whatever reason, he was strolling on his rooftop in the evening, and he saw a woman bathing below his rooftop, and he made a choice to think about that and meditate on it, and his flesh rose up almost immediately, it seems from the context here, and just overwhelmed him, and he was not ready for that. He was not prepared. He did not have Ephesians 6. He did not have the armor on. He was just engulfed so quickly, caught him by surprise, ambushed him, if you will. Since he is a military leader, we can use military terms. It just ambushed David. And it's not as though it's someone else's fault. David here is at fault. And the writer in this book of Samuel does not make any attempt to put David in a better light than what he should have been. All eyes are focused on David. We hear only 3 words from Bathsheba in the first 5 verses. I am pregnant. And now in verses 6 through 13, all we hear from Uriah are words that are more admirable and more honored than David's words himself. So David, this is a dark time in his life. He's not meditating on the Word of God like he should be, like has written in the Psalms for us to read. He's overwhelmed by this. And we're going to see in verses 6 and following that he seems to make no attempt to confess and make things right. He's following through with the desires of his flesh, and he immediately responds to a plan of how do I get rid of Uriah? How do I escape the blame of this? It's a sad part in David's life. But you see it in the lives of people. There are men, perhaps, and women that you might have thought could never do this. I would never think of this man or that man getting in this kind of trouble or being in that kind of trouble. I admired them so. How could they do this? Any man, any woman is capable. As we read a comment from a commentary, Ralph Davis's commentary, I read a sentence or two. If you think that I could never, then you've taken the first step towards your demise. Never be surprised at what you're capable of. You always have to stay in front of the Lord, keep the armor on. And I've heard people say that about preachers that you and I know and you and I respect, and we look up to them. And the preacher has told congregations at seminars and conferences, he'll say, people have come up to me and say, please don't fall. Please don't fall. This point in your life, please don't fall. Don't do this or that or the other. We have Dinesh D'Souza, who put out the movie 2016, who's the president of King's College, having an affair with someone else now, and staying in a motel with someone who's not his wife. Several men have been this way, have fallen to this kind of sin. We are all capable of it. And from the first 5 verses the inference is often drawn that Bathsheba should not have been exposing herself as she did, and that it was her discretion or her indiscretion which started the whole sequence of events. And some think that her actions may have been deliberate. She knew that David was there. She knew that David could see her. Well, there are other people, other commentators, who would be more gracious and assume that it was simply poor judgment on her part. But we need to consider the observations from the text. First of all, when Nathan pronounces divine judgment upon David for his sin, and he'll do that in the next chapter in verses 10 and 12, it is Bathsheba and Uriah are depicted as victims, not villains. When Adam and Eve sinned, God specifically indicted Adam and Eve and the serpent, and each received their just curse. And it's simply not the case with Bathsheba here. Nowhere in the Bible is she indicted for this sin. It may be that the author, the writer here, did not choose to focus on Bathsheba, and we noted that last week. The focus is all on David. But even in the case where it's all on David, the law would clearly require us to consider her innocent until proven guilty. It was very clear here in Samuel that the tragedies which take place in David's household are the consequence of his sin, just as Nathan indicates. Chapter 12 and verses 10 and following. The indictment is, you have despised me and taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. And all of that, of course, includes the adultery that was committed. So the author here keeps all eyes on David, whether there was an internal debate within David himself or even guilt over his sin. The text doesn't even tell us that at all. David is portrayed to be single-minded regarding his dilemma. Confession seems to be totally out of the question and appears only in Psalms 32 and 51 regarding this event. Everything but confession at this point will take David further from pleasing God, and he did everything but confess. And we'll see that in just a moment. In fact, David compounded his sin by trying to cover it up rather than confessing it. Now, we do that probably more often than we would like to admit, and certainly we would like to confess. We're kind of like big kids. We know when you catch a kid doing something, you catch them red-handed, they have a choice, and they immediately decide whether to start waxing eloquent on an excuse or a reason why it happened, or, I'm sorry, Dad, please forgive me. David made the choice of starting to try to wax eloquent and make excuses and cover up. And he compounded his sin when he did this. He tried 3 cover-ups. He tried a clean one, a clean cover-up in verses 6 through 11, and then a dirty cover-up in verses 12 and 13, and we'll look at both of those today. And then he tried a criminal cover-up, and that's in verses 14 through 17. And we'll look at that one in the following verses next week. So let's read through this section 6 through 13, then we'll come back and make some comments. Then David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked concerning the welfare of Joab and the people and the state of war. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." And Uriah went out of the king's house, and a present from the king was sent out after him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. Now when they told David, saying, "Uriah didn't go down to his house," David said to him, "Have you not come from a journey? Why do you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? By your life and the life of your soul, I will not do this thing." Now here's the dirty cover-up. And David said to Uriah, "Stay here today also, and tomorrow, and I will let you go." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem, and the day and the next. Now David called him, and he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. David made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his bed with his Lord's servants, but he did not go down to his house. And then in verses 14 through 17, he's going to try the criminal cover-up. He's arranging for someone to die. Arrange it so that he'll die in battle. So let's look at the clean cover-up and the dirty cover-up, and then we'll come back next week and look at this. This is so... Now we look at this and we think it is so sad of David, and we wonder, why is he doing this? It's almost the thought is that David can't do this. I mean, doesn't he realize what he's doing? Now, you and I can read about this, and we see this, and we think, oh no, nothing good is going to come of this. Oh, he did this terrible thing. Now what's he going to do next? He's going to try to cover it up. Oh no, I can't believe David. But, beloved, you and I do the same thing in just more sophisticated ways, and we cannot do that. We need to see that in our life. The Spirit of God, we pray, is convicting us when something like this happens. There's no cover up here. We cannot cover it up. You cannot hide from God. We know it's coming. We see it. How can such a stalwart of faith allow this to happen? Beware lest you fall, Paul says. We are all capable of this. So here's the clean cover-up in verses 6 through 11. You see that the text begins with the word then. Then David sent to Joab. So then shows the progression of the story. The end of verse 5 is, I'm pregnant. The sequence, the next thing that David does, that's the sequence. The then indicates the sequence. So we have a progression in the story here. What prompted David to call Uriah was those infamous 3 words, I am pregnant. Sometime after she sent word to David, he sent for Uriah. And the reason becomes clear in the following passage. It was clearly in order to protect both himself and Bathsheba. Because as we noted last week, the punishment for what has happened here, the punishment for adultery, is the stoning of both David and Bathsheba. So he is doing, it's clear, there's no doubt why he's doing this. In order to protect himself and Bathsheba, David wants Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba so that people will think that Uriah is the father of the child. So if that's the case, it must have been, we're not talking 3 months after she said, I am pregnant, because then it would be obvious it's not Uriah. So it's relatively soon after the statement, I am pregnant. Relatively soon. It seems to be a flawless, a simple plan. Think about it. You got a guy who's been at battle for perhaps months, weeks at least. He's been fighting. Who wouldn't like to come home for a couple of days of R&R and go home and see his wife? Oh my goodness. This is a simple and flawless plan. What man would say no to this? And the text has already told us Bathsheba is a fine-looking woman. So you see the thought pattern is, oh, this is a no-brainer here. I can get this done. Watch this. Have him come back and then give him a special blessing of being able to spend the night with his wife. The writer was not content to tell the story in his own words. The spotlight remains on David through here. Then David sent word to Joab that he should send Uriah the Hittite back to Jerusalem to appear at the palace. That's the way the thing reads. That's what he means. The sequence continues. Then Joab sent Uriah to David. And so when Uriah arrives, David asks 3 questions. And the translations that are out there are different in their wording, but the Hebrew word is the same. So in the New American Standard, you have, when Uriah came to him, David asked concerning the welfare of Joab and the people and the state of the war. The New American Standard uses the word, the state of the welfare. That welfare is used 3 times in the Hebrew verse there. The New American Standard communicates it like this: the welfare of Joab, the people, and the state of war. If you have a American Standard Version, it reads like this: and when Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab did, how the people fared, and how the war prospered. But in reality, those are all the same Hebrew words. The ESV is a little bit closer. It says, when Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. So different translations will say it different ways. But think about this. This was about a 40-mile trip back to Jerusalem for one of David's commanders. This man, Uriah, is one of David's mighty men. So he's a commander of some degree. Furthermore, he was taken out of that command, whatever he had. So when Uriah arrives back at the palace and David asks him such things as, well, how's it going? How's the war going? How are the people doing? And how's Joab doing? Uriah must have scratched his head and said, what? You brought me all the way back, 40-mile trip. I leave my men. I'm a commander to ask me these questions. Must have been puzzled when the king questioned him about comparatively trivial information. David could have acquired that kind of information that he was asking about from any of the runners that must have been going back and forth, probably on a daily basis, bringing information of the war back to David. So verse 8, from David's point of view, it was simply unfortunate that she conceived, and the best solution all around was to convince Uriah that he was the dad. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house, wash your feet. And Uriah went out to the king's house, and a present from the king was sent out after him. So in an effort to appear generous and appreciative of Uriah's efforts and information, David directed Uriah to go down to your house and wash your feet. It sounds very odd. Go down to your house and wash your feet. I can wash my feet here, thank you. However, David's reference to foot washing was a suggestion that he go in and enjoy the relationship that he has with his wife. Implicitly, it was an order to spend the night of marital intimacy with Bathsheba. That's what he is intending for Uriah to do. Uriah understands that as well, but he doesn't do it. There's no question about Uriah's not scratching his head and saying, I need some clarification here. What do you mean wash my feet? He knows exactly what David is saying. Knows exactly. In fact, he says in a later verse, didn't I tell you to go down to your house? And Uriah said, look, the ark and the people and everybody else is sleeping in tents, and should I go into my house and lie with my wife? See, Uriah understands perfectly well what David is saying to him. It's not a question about, are you kidding? Wash your feet? Well, that's very odd. So to encourage the celebrative moment in the household, David sent a gift. You know, at the text at the end of verse 8, it says he sent a gift, probably of food and wine. David provided room service for them to Uriah's residence. However, neither David's directive nor his gift achieved their intended purpose, for Uriah did not go down to his house. Did not go down to his house. There are some commentators at this point that speculate that Uriah suspected something was awry here, something was wrong here, because maybe, and the reason that Uriah thought that maybe something was wrong because there is court gossip. There are people that are talking within the court, and maybe Uriah heard some of this, but this idea is not supported by any statement in the text at all. They're just trying to come up with an explanation other than what the text gives us for why Uriah didn't go sleep with his wife. And it turns out to be a very admirable reason, as we see in verse 9 and 10, or verse 10 specifically. So Uriah's refusal to sleep with his wife at this time was clearly an expression of his devotion to the Lord. All sanctioned military activity was a form of service to the Lord. This is holy war. And Israel was instructed to eliminate certain nations, the Canaanites, within the Holy Land. Otherwise, you will learn their ways and you will serve their gods. And so you need to eliminate these people, some of these peoples in here. So all military service was a form, or military activity was a form of service to the Lord. And it required the Lord's blessings for success. In order to maximize the probability of receiving that blessing in the military endeavors, David seems to have required soldiers carrying out military assignments to keep themselves in the state of purity, which necessarily meant you not engage in relations with your wife during the time of battle. And you can look back to chapter 21 and verse 5 of 1 Samuel. Exodus chapter 19 and verse 15 as well. So if Uriah had relations with his wife, he would have rendered himself temporarily unfit for military service, according to Leviticus 15 and verse 18, and thus unfit for service to the Lord. So it's an admirable response. Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all his servants of his Lord and did not go down to his house. Now in verse 10, they told David about this. And they said, Uriah didn't go down to his house. So David asked him, why didn't you do that? You've come from a long journey. You haven't seen your wife in at least weeks, if not months. Why didn't you go down to your house? So verse 11, Uriah's reference to the ark being a temporary shelter probably refers to some location where the ark is at this point. It's temporary. It's not a tabernacle necessarily that's permanent. You see, Bathsheba's husband was a Hittite, Uriah the Hittite. He appears to have been a godly believer, a proselyte, if you will, as well as a dedicated warrior. As we noted, he was one of David's best soldiers, one of David's mighty men. In this book, 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 39, Uriah was a great man. And by his response that we see here in verses 8, 9, 10, and 11, he is indeed a great man, a great warrior. So when he says in verse 11, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in an open field, I'm not going to go down to my house and drink and lie with my wife. I will not do this thing. How do you think that made David feel? David knew, he had to know, he's right. Uriah is right. David has to grieve God, and he had to know that he was grieving God. I have to grieve God even more. My conscience is screaming at me, but I'm not even entertaining confession. So after those admirable words that must have cut David to the core, he must find it in him to go further, to grieve his God more, to get this done, he's thinking, so that he's not caught in this sin. Now, David knows better. David has expressed his understanding that God knows everything. He knows the thought of man. God always supplies. God always provides. God always knows what's going on. But for some reason, the deceitfulness of sin has so clouded his thinking that he actually thinks that he can get away with it. His sin his weakness toward, this is David. David's sin, David's weakness toward immorality must have convinced David that a plan to arrange a night for a husband and a wife would certainly not fail. David's putting himself in Uriah's shoes and thinking, surely this will work. It would work for me. He did not anticipate Uriah being a better man than he was. He did not anticipate Uriah being a better man than he was. Perhaps frustrating, aggravating, and so he's going to resort to a dirty cover-up in verses 12 and 13, and then a criminal cover-up in verses 14 and following. How is it that a man like David can do things of like this nature, these kinds of acts, and think these kinds of things? Beloved, that is the deceitfulness of sin. That's just the way sin works. It is so powerful, so overwhelming at times if we are not ready for it. If we are not staying in the Word and meditating on the Word, thinking about God, acting wisely and living wisely, not exposing ourselves to things that we do not have to expose ourselves to. It can jump up and figuratively bite us and get us, or it will slowly erode until we look completely unlike what we looked like and acted like years before. And it's always a danger as long as we're in this body. Always. David is in his late 40s. Some commentators say middle 50s when this takes place in his life. David's my age, 53. He's my age when this happens. Probably halfway through his 40-year reign, he got soft. He stopped relying on the Lord in ways that he had in his earlier years. One commentator, Joyce Baldwin, writes this: astonishingly, this Hittite mentions the covenant symbol before everything else that has influenced his behavior. That is the ark, when he says the ark and Israel. He is also aware of his solidarity with the fighting men at the front, over whom he will not steal an advantage. Both of these considerations even more forcibly to the king, who had final responsibility for the war, and had laid much stress on covenant loyalty himself. But now a foreigner is showing him to be despicably lax. He did not anticipate Uriah being a better man than him. David's soul was so clouded by the wish to keep clear of the consequences of his sin in the eyes of the world that he did not feel the sting, but simply made a further attempt to attain his purpose with Uriah. And so we look at verses 12 and 13, a dirty cover-up. Just talking with Uriah and appealing to him to go and spend the night with your wife, enjoy a couple of days of R&R. He did not anticipate Uriah being a more honorable man than him. So, will David at this point confess? Will David recognize the screaming conscience within him? Will he press forward and continue to squelch his conscience, or will he respond to it? He's not going to. He's going to squelch his conscience. He's going to grieve his God even more. And in verse 12, he's going to say, "Stay here today also, and tomorrow, and I will let you go." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now David called him, and he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his bed with his Lord's servants, but he did not go down to his house. This is the dirty cover-up. David's next plan: was to get Uriah drunk, hoping that in that condition he would return home to sleep with his wife. David knows what alcohol does to people. Clouds judgment. Uriah has responded with a great level of good judgment, a high level of good judgment. Perhaps now alcohol will dull that judgment, will dull that sense of loyalty to Joab and his men. And then it will take over, other things will take over, and then he'll go home and spend the night with his wife. But again, David did not anticipate Uriah being a better man than him. So David is going to use alcohol to manipulate him. Everyone responded to the king's bidding. When David sent for Bathsheba, what is Bathsheba going to say? No, I'm not going. Everyone responded to the king's bidding. He's the king. But again, David underestimated Uriah. The text is silent here, but God was not absent from any of the thoughts of David. We know that, even though the text doesn't say that. God is behind the scenes watching all of this. We know this. It'll come out in chapter 12. His plan in response to David, according to his counsel and providence, was to expose his sin to a point of deep humiliation. So even though the text doesn't mention God here, God is aware of everything that's going on, and God's plan in response to David's actions here, according to his own counsel and his own providence, is that he's going to expose David's sin to a point of deep humiliation. We'll see that here in a couple of weeks. One commentator said, the despicableness of the king's behavior contrasts with the noble figure of the wronged Uriah, several times referred to as the Hittite, as if to emphasize that whereas the king of Israel was so obviously lacking in principle, the same could not be said of this foreigner. Uriah was a good man. In heaven, I suspect we will meet Uriah. Scripture, God in his good providence has not purposed that very much information be included in Scripture about Uriah. We know that he was a man of integrity from chapter 11 here. We know from chapter 23 that he was a great warrior. He was a man who believed in the God of Yahweh. And so he underwent the ritual circumcision. He went through all of these things because he was a believer in the God of Israel, Yahweh. A fine man. But you saw the end of verse 13. He did not go down to his house. Will David respond now in confession? Will his conscience continue to scream and get louder and louder, and will he listen? Will David do what he knows is right, or will he continue in this course? Verse 14, he's not going to confess. He's not going to make it right. Now he resorts to the level of murder. He's going to have Uriah put in a place in battle intentionally with the intention that he would die. And so David is going to be guilty of murder. It was intentional, was planned. He's guilty. And we'll see that in verses 14 through 17, a criminal cover-up. And then the results, what happens when he does lose his life in that battle. Verse 18, Joab sent and reported to David all the events of the war and the things that happened following that. Sad, sad day. Beloved, don't let this happen to you. Don't let this. Nick, don't let it happen to you. David, don't. Nobody. Ray, don't let this happen to you, Jeff. Ramesh. Ladies, Don't let this happen. Don't let the world, don't let your flesh get away from you. Stay in the Word. Spend time in prayer daily with your Lord. Be wise about how you live. Find your joy and your happiness and fulfillment in the spouse that the Lord gives you. And don't go looking around. Don't think that there's something better around the corner. It's just not true. God doesn't make mistakes. You have the woman and the man in your life that God has given you. God doesn't make mistakes. Bring your heart and your thinking in submission to the Word of God and find your joy in your home. Father, thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your blessings, Father. Thank you for the joy you've given to us. This is not a pleasant study. And the more we study it, the more guilty David becomes. It just gets darker and darker, especially with the contrast of Uriah, the man of integrity, the honorable man. And we see it before our eyes as we read it. The deceitfulness of sin just keeps getting darker and darker in David's vision.